me throughout the whole of this controversy that sooner or later truth is omnipotent and public justice certain. The whole of this controversy has lasted over 150 years. We weren't really sure exactly what had happened at the battle. His full report of the battle was about a half a page, where he described that he met the Indians. They called down to him to fight, and there was but one thing to do. So the battle took place. He lost, out of 60 dragoons, he lost 22 that were killed on the battle site. 23 were wounded, and one of those died later from his wounds. So it was a pretty significant defeat for the military and a victory for the Jicarilla Apache. Davidson, well, the battle is near the area of Pilar. At that time, Pilar was known as Cieneguilla, hence the name of the battle. It's kind of a very unremarkable looking area when you're out there. You can't really tell you're on a battle site. It's not like a Civil War battlefield or anything. You've got pretty thick vegetation, mixed conifer. Probably not nearly as thick back 150 years ago. Part of that's a result of the changes in vegetation. But you can kind of see that it's a combination of steep ridges and narrow canyons. Davidson came to Fort Burgoyne in the summer of 1853. And he was a trained soldier. I believe he's a West Point graduate. Spent some time in California. He fought the war with Mexico. And his first experience with Indian fighting was in California, where he raided a couple of villages, killed dozens of Indians, didn't lose any soldiers, and kind of figured that it was a pretty easy way for glory. He came here at Fort Burgoyne about the time that there were some raids going on the east side of the mountains. Some of it was Utes, some of it was the Apache, some of it was local settlers as well. But the soldiers started looking into the actions that were going on, and Davidson was one of them that was sent over to kind of keep an eye on what was going on. He met a group of Jicarilla that were coming up from Mora and described it as 107 warriors with their families. And those were the Indians that were over here at Cieneguilla on their way from the east coming west. Not too long after that, a few days after that, Kit Carson met with that group, or a couple of the chiefs of that group, and they told Kit Carson that they were there to make pottery, that they weren't looking for trouble, they were peaceful, and they were just there to make pots for trade. When Davidson got back to the fort, Colonel Blake, or Major Blake, sent him to track the Indians, see where they were going, see if they had crossed the Rio Grande. So it was on March 29th that he left the fort down towards Cieneguilla. He camped there that night, and the next morning he went up into the mountains to try to see where the Indians had camped out. And again, here he said that when he met the Indians, they at once commenced the war whoop, and there's but one thing to do. And that's when the battle started. This is a sketch of the battle that was drawn 2 years later during the Court of Inquiry. And you can see in the lower corner here is Cieneguilla, the Rio Grande River. Note that the north arrow points down. The old trail to Embudo up this way. And this is the trail that the soldiers went into the mountains. You can see that he went up here, it says ascending right here. And then up on this slope, this is where the horse soldiers dismounted, and then they went up the ridge to where the Indian camp was. Now, it's presumably down here somewhere that the Indians, the accounts differ depending on who you read. During the Court of Inquiry, I think one of them said they called down in English, one said they called down in Spanish, and I think a third one said in broken English, but essentially called down and said, if you want to fight, come on, you know. So he dismounted his horses and broke into two groups, went up here, and as soon as he got up into the camp, or shortly before then, shots fired out. And we don't know whether the Indians fired first or the soldiers, but that was the beginning of the battle. Davidson left the assistant surgeon, Dr. Magruder, with about 9 soldiers down here to watch the horses. The rest of them went up into the Indian camp. The Indians immediately proceeded to leave the Indian camp and surround the soldiers that were left with the horses down here. So Davidson, after just a matter of 5-10 minutes, decided that he better get back down here and protect the horses. So he retreated back down the slope. Now all of the soldiers were down on the low ground. The Apaches were surrounding him, firing down on top of him. So he kind of put himself in a spot. One of the soldiers had been killed up in the Indian camp itself, but 4 others were killed in this position. He claims that there were about 2 hours that he was pinned down in this location, and decided that he needed to get out. He could tell that it wasn't working. He could see from where he was that there was a nearby ridge that looked like a better location, more defensible. So it shows this change from point B to D up here to this point of a hill. Now, nowhere in here does he use the words retreat, but he changed positions from here to here, and once again encountered the Jicarilla Apache. They saw where he was going, and they headed him off. He lost 17 soldiers in this area. This map has X's all over it, and some of them are right and some of them are wrong. There's way too many X's in this area. We know from all the accounts that there were 5 soldiers killed at the first part of the battle, and 17 here, probably 15 along the slopes, and then they did find a couple more soldiers down in the canyon down below. So anyway, Davidson did round up the wounded and made it back to Fort Burgoyne that night. And the next day they sent some soldiers out and some locals to retrieve the bodies. The bodies were brought back to Taos and buried in Kit Carson Cemetery. We found out about the battle. Most of the people we were working with were well aware of it. But several people had been doing some research in the past. John Young, the forest archaeologist, had information on the battle. Jack Boyer, back in the 60s, had done some research and had some information. Larry Ludwig, who's one of these here, you can't see him right now, with the Park Service, was a bit of an expert on the battle. So we decided that we could locate it from the information that we had. So we decided also that the best way to find the battle was not just a typical survey, but we needed metal detectors to find the bullets, the metal arrow points. So our initial strategy was to hit the ridges that were within a couple of miles of where we thought the battle had been, and spread out and just walk along all of these ridges until we found evidence of the battle. It's amazing how much beer can fragments and baling wire, and even way out where you think there's nothing, but you do find a lot of junk out there. But we spent the first part of I guess year 2000 and 2001 mostly combing these ridges. You can see that a lot of times there was a lot of brush on the ground, underbrush, made it a little bit difficult. This is Chris Adams from the Lincoln National Forest. Here Larry Ludwig and I believe Charlie Hecker from the Park Service. Probably no more than 4 or 5 people on most days. Occasionally we get a few more people than that. Most of the time we're doing this on weekends with volunteers. These people, Larry was coming up from Bowie, Arizona. And we spent a lot of time trying to find the initial parts of the battle. And eventually we hit an area where we started finding round balls fired by the military, arrow points fired by the Apache, a military button. We knew that we were starting to get into the battle at that point. From there, it was a lot easier to determine where the various retreats, the horse position, and the Indian camp would be. And within the next 2 years, we found those as well. Not all of the artifacts were metal. Probably the most common artifact that we found up in the Indian camp was the pottery. And these are fairly typical examples of Jicarilla Apache pottery. I don't know if you can tell in the slides here, but the rims are very flat on top. And there is a lot of mica in these. Again, it doesn't show up in the slide. But we found the artifacts, the sherds, in two different concentrations on the ridge. So it almost looked like there were two different camps that we were looking at, possibly even different time periods. Some of the other artifacts also were different depending on which group we were looking at. But then in reading the historic accounts, the Jicarilla that were moving this way there were two chiefs. So there were two groups. We think it's probably more likely that this represents the two different groups that were there. We had Sunday Eisel from here at SNU, Fort Bergwin, did an analysis of the ceramics and some clay sources nearby, was able to determine that all of the potsherds came from pots that had been made from clay that came from within 5 to 10 miles from where the battle is. Some of the clay sources were even right on the battle site. And again, that's significant that the Jicarilla had said that they were just going there to make pots for trade, that they weren't looking for any trouble. They also fit the descriptions when she reconstructed some of the shapes of Jicarilla Apache pottery. Most of the artifacts, though, again, we were using metal detectors, were metal. These are examples of what they call coscojos, which are small metal, like tinklers or jingles that would be on the bits and the bridles of the Spanish horses, and they would trade them to the Indians. We found a number of these in the Indian camp. A number of metal awls. And the awl is like the Leatherman tool of the day. You know, everybody had an awl as a kind of a multi-purpose thing. We also found these brass conchos. There were 3 of them on the site, all of them in the one concentration of ceramics. Only one of them had been drilled like this, so we think they were manufacturing these on the site. We also found scraps that were left from what they were making them out of. This is an old brass kettle, hand-forged iron remnants of a handle, and they've been cut with a knife or a chisel, probably a knife and a hammer combination, into these little pieces where they were making various ornaments out of them. Down at the bottom are what we call jingles or tinklers, and the 3 on the left here are made out of brass. These are made out of iron, probably from salvaged tin cans, those sorts of things. All of the scraps match the tinklers here, and these also were found at the same ceramic concentration as the conchos. This is part of a brass canister lid that had a patent date of 1844, so very typical. It looks like the right time period. Give it a few years from when something would be traded in to where it would be used by the Apache. We would find similar slivers like these made out of iron where they were, or tin, where they were making metal arrow points as well. A lot of times they take the barrel bands from the hoops on a barrel, cut them into pieces, and then cut out arrow points out of those. The arrow points were one of the most interesting artifacts we found throughout the battle site. We had 40 different points, and they fit into maybe 35 different styles. This is just one small group. You can see the wide range of shapes. The one on the far left is probably, the one in the center is probably the same. The stem is broken off of it. Those are very typical of the points we would find in southern New Mexico and Mescalero Apache sites. But on the battle sites I've worked on down there, all of the points were very uniform, very much the same. So it was unusual to see this wide variety of points. We think that probably a good explanation for this is the Taos trade fairs. That the Jicarilla would come to Taos and trade with the Comanche, with the Utes, with the local settlers. Some of the points look like they were commercially made trade points. Others look like they were handmade, possibly traded to the Jicarilla. And then others they were probably making right there on the site. They were also using rifles and pistols. The Jicarilla at that time were not just using the bow and arrow. And their bullets are fairly easy to distinguish. I'll show you the comparison with the military bullets in a second. But you can see that they were basically shooting anything that they could get to fit inside the gun. The one on this side has tooth marks all over it, where they would actually cut off a piece of lead, pop it in their mouth, and chew it until it was round or until it was the right size to fit. And in fact, Gifford Velarde, one of the tribal archaeologists that was working with us, said that there's still a saying in Jicarilla Apache to this day that, you know, if you're slow or taking your time, you're chewing your lead, or something translates similar to that. This one in the center just looks like a hammered piece of lead. These two are actually small segments of lead cylinders that, like they had a rod that they would just kind of cut it and shape it enough to where it finally fit. They were probably using flintlocks as well, because it was easy to maintain. They could get flints. They didn't have to get percussion caps. So the combination of these, you know, they were a pretty effective fighting force. They had guns and they had bows and arrows. One other comment about all the other different types of artifacts we've seen: they were making pottery, they were making conchos, they were making jingles. This was a group of Apaches with their families. It wasn't just warriors set out waiting in ambush. They were there. They weren't too far from a major trail. The evidence seems to fit pretty well with the fact that they were not looking for trouble. The military, on the other hand, had well-manufactured arms. The bullets were carefully cast. They were all very uniform. The ones on the left were for the model 1847 musketoon. It was a smoothbore 69 caliber single shot. They would quite often load it with a single 69 caliber ball, and sometimes they would load it with what was called a buck and ball. And the buck and ball had the large round ball and 3 or sometimes 4 buckshot, which was about a 31 caliber buckshot. So these would be wrapped up into a paper cartridge with the powder, so they could just put it in the gun, ram it in, and they were ready to go. And the musketoon, not being a very accurate weapon, when you loaded it up like this, you didn't have to be real accurate. The next one here is a 54 caliber ball that was for what they called a horse pistol. It was a large pistol that would mount in a holster on the saddle, hence the name horse pistol. We did find 1 or 2 dropped rounds of this that also had the buckshot with it. So occasionally they were using the buck and ball load in the pistols as well. And then the one on the far right is a conical bullet. We only found 2 of these, and they were manufactured for the Colt Dragoon revolver. We do know from the written accounts that the Dragoons were using all 3 of these weapons. Only a few of them had the Dragoon revolvers. Most of them were armed with the musketoon and the horse pistol. All 3 of those, the pistols and the rifle, or the musketoon, were percussion cap instead of flintlock. These were small caps that had a charge in them. This is very typical of the style the military was using, sometimes referred to as a top hat style of a percussion cap. The one on the far right is a smaller one for a pistol, possibly for the Dragoon revolver. These other ones are both interchangeable with the musketoon and the horse pistol. They would fit on a small little nipple on the end of the gun. When the hammer hit the cap, the charge in that would send a fire down the little tube that would ignite the powder in the gun and fire the ball. You can imagine this is about a 1/4 of an inch across, probably. That if you're in a battle situation where you've got Indians shooting at you and you're trying to load your gun, you're going to drop a lot of these. And we did find more than half of the caps that we did recover were dropped and had never been fired. It's fairly easy to tell when they have been fired. They tend to spread out like these. Also, when they've been fired, the hammer leaves a mark. You can kind of see this one on here that's unique to the individual gun that fired it. Now, Doug Scott had done some work with the Battle of Little Bighorn, where he examined the cartridges that were found, and he could look at the hammer marks and the extractor marks on the cartridges and identify individual rifles that could trace the soldiers throughout the battlefield. Now, we didn't have a large collection of these. We had, I think, 105 percussion caps, but Doug Scott agreed to do an examination of these, and he was able to also do the same thing with the percussion caps. He could identify individual guns based on the marks on these caps. Unfortunately, we only had 4 or 5 matches but one of them was real significant in that a cap that was found where the troops had dismounted and were pinned down with their horses matched one of the percussion caps that was found on the final retreat route. So even though those artifact scatters were a half a mile apart, we were able to provide more evidence that they were part of the same battle. Also found a number of uniform components, military buttons. The two on the left are the uniform coat buttons, cuff buttons, the smaller ones. There's a D in the center of the shield with an eagle on it. The back has a maker's mark on it. These were Scoville and Sons. And the style and the mark on the back indicated that they were made between 1840 and 1850. Other buttons are typical trouser buttons, and all very typical of the uniform that was issued in 1851, which is what the dragoons would have been using in 1854. There's a close-up of the dragoon button. We only found two of these, but again, very good evidence that we were dealing with the dragoons. These are some more elements of the uniform. This is a back plate from a buckle for an equipment belt. This is what they call an accoutrement hook or a saber hook that would also attach to the belt. This is a uniform suspender buckle. This is bent out of shape. It should form a nice little U like this, but this bend in it right here, you can't quite see it from the picture here, but there's a dent with some lead smudged in it right here, where apparently this was shot off of a soldier's belt. And this is a drawing of what the belt would look like with the back plate, the hook on it, the buckle would be on the other side, and in fact here you can see the area on where the bullet had hit the hook. We also found a number of tools that were very specific to the types of weapons that the dragoons were using. The top one is a combination screwdriver nipple wrench for the model 1847 musketoon. They manufactured individual tools for individual guns, so we knew from this that we were dealing with the musketoons. This is a worm or an extractor. We found two of these. They would screw onto the end of the ramrod, and they would use these to pull misfired balls out of the barrel, so that if you had something wedged in there, they could jam that in there, screw it around, and pull it out. Again, very, very specific to a very single type of gun. And then this is an actual part of the model 1847 musketoon. There's a small brass plate mounted on the side of it, and then this is a metal rod that attaches to it that would have a ring on it that they would use to attach it to either the saddle or to that accoutrement hook on their belt, so that they had a way to anchor the gun. And we also found with this a small nut that was identified as the trigger guard screw. So it looked like this was a gun that had broken, or perhaps had been fired and shot, and these pieces had broken off of it. Found a number of military spurs as well. Two different types. There were two of these, like the one on the left, that were made out of solid brass. Two, like the one on the right, they're cast iron with a brass or a gold plating on it. Back in those days, they issued spurs to the enlisted men. They would have been the brass military issue spur. The officers had to buy their own, and quite often they would choose the plated style. It was a little bit lighter, a little more uniformly made. Again, we think these were part of the 1851 issued uniform, but nobody knows what the spurs looked like for that time period. There was a design made by Grimsley in 1847 that was supposed to go into production in 1851, but there weren't any really good sketches of the spur to be able to identify it. Then in 1859, they came up with another style spur, which was common throughout the Civil War. As a result, spurs like this brass one had been found, but a lot of them were attributed to the 1860s through the 1880s, where there was a commercially made spur that closely resembled this. In fact, we think that this is another sketch of the brass spur. We think that this probably is the Grimsley design, and that this is probably also then the design that was used by the commercial spur makers in the 1860s. The other spurs, the iron ones, were interesting that if they were purchased by the officers, there were only 2 officers on the battle. One of them was Davidson and one of them was Dr. Magruder. We found 2 spurs like this. One of them had an M carved in it. And we were thinking, well, you know, maybe this is Magruder's spur, you know, or maybe it was a size medium. We don't know for sure. But in the end, we had close to 1,000 artifacts. And you can see from this map here that from the bottom down here to the top, you're looking at about a mile, maybe half a mile from here to here. We surveyed an area, you know, much larger than this. You know, most of it was at the reconnaissance level, not all of it was at the intensive survey. It's when we finally found the battle. But we did pin it down pretty well, and the artifacts make an interesting pattern that was very similar to that map that was prepared 2 years after the battle. This location here is the final retreat where the 17 soldiers were killed. This little string of artifacts here was following an old trail that we found. They weren't related to the battle, but they dated to the right time period, or even earlier. And we think that was evidence that this was the trail from Pilar, or then Cieneguilla, to Picaril's Pueblo. And the trail had been there a long time. In fact, in 1705, a Spaniard named Roque Madrid was going on an expedition from Picaril's on up towards the Navajo country. And he described the trail from Picaril's following a very narrow, treacherous trail down to the Rio Grande. So the troops would have come in on this trail, turned up this little side canyon, and this is where he dismounted his troops. We know that, again, because of the map, also because we found dropped percussion caps, dropped balls, fired Apache balls and arrow points coming in towards them, military buttons, horseshoe fragments, horseshoe nails. It fit very well with what was going on. The cluster up here on the ridge, this is where the Indian camp was. And you can see it's a little bit harder to tell since I have all the artifacts plotted here, but there were 2 clusters of artifacts down here. And this is where we're thinking the 2 different chiefs were probably camped out. The whole of the scatter of the camp, the ridge is really pretty narrow, a lot narrower than these contour lines show, but there's not room for a lot of people to have been up there. You know, if the description by Kit Carson and the others that there was about 100 warriors and their wives, that probably would make sense. However, Davidson, after the battle, claimed that he was attacked by 200 to 300 warriors. We just don't see the evidence that they could have been there. I think it probably helped him justify his loss a little bit better, you know, to raise the number of Indians. Or it's possible there were others camped elsewhere that came in and joined. In fact, there's a story from Picaril's Pueblo that claims that the Jicarilla sent runners down to the Pueblo, and they sent some of their warriors to help and were actually part of the battle. The period documents, though, don't mention anything about Picaril's, so I don't think there's enough evidence to say that they were really part of it. In fact, there is another document that Jack Boyer recorded from from Picaril's Indian describing the battle, and this was written down in 1965, and I believe it came from the same source as the later version, but in the earlier version, the Picaril's indeed knew about the battle and heard about it, but by the time they got there to help, it was already over, and they saw the arrows in the ground, and they saw the dead horses, and that they didn't actually participate. So it's a little difficult to say, but the artifacts we found seem to indicate that it was Jicarilla. From this position, when they came back down, they briefly retreated over here. We found a couple of spurs and more of the military and Apache artifacts here. And then they went back here and up the side of the mountain and then out. We know this is where they went up because of the cluster of artifacts at the bottom. lot of them were Apache artifacts fired at them, some boot nails that were dropped along the way or fell out along the way. And these artifacts up here was the side plate from the musketoon, the trigger guard screw, and a ball from the horse pistol that had been dropped. This dot over here, incidentally, is not an artifact. We recorded a juniper tree that probably not related to the battle, but there had been a strip of wood carved out of it where it was chopped at the top and peeled down and chopped at the bottom, a real narrow strip that looked like somebody had cut wood for a bow out of that tree. So we decided that was something we wanted to keep track of. Now, once we were done with the survey, while we were finding the artifacts, we were recording them with a handheld GPS unit. It was fairly accurate. At this scale, everything was pretty good, but it wasn't quite as accurate as what we wanted. So we brought the Forest Service land surveyors in with a total station, and we surveyed each individual artifact in and tied it into a brass cap. So we can go literally within a centimeter of where these artifacts were picked up, the ones that were collected, and go right back to that spot. Most of the artifacts that were battle-related, we did bring back to the lab to do analysis. We only took a sample of the ceramics. Some things that were not well preserved we left out there, but we felt we needed enough to do an accurate description of the artifacts and also to preserve them before they did get picked up. I mean, we were using metal detectors, and I think we demonstrated that it was a very effective way to find the battle site. We were afraid somebody else would do the same thing. In fact, there may be evidence that somebody had been on part of the battle. According to the accounts from Davidson, as soon as they reached the top of the ridge, they were met by the Apache. And we found virtually nothing up here. It wasn't until they reached the end of the ridge down here that we started picking up the battle artifacts again. It's possible that somebody had hunted this area and removed the artifacts. I think it's more likely, though, that just wasn't part of the battle. So again, this time I've turned the map around so the north arrow is pointing up. And you can see the pattern fits very well with the 1856 map. You've got Cieneguilla. You've got the trail going up into the mountains. They went up to the side. They dismounted the troops. But it doesn't show this as a little canyon or ravine. It just shows them on the side of the slope. From there, they went up to the Indian camp, went back down, went over here to what was described as the point of the hill, and then retreated down the next canyon. So I think from this we can show that the battle took place very much as Davidson said it did, with some significant differences. I think we can show that even though he claimed repeatedly that he did not leave his soldiers in the bottom of a canyon, that technically he's correct. He did not leave them in the bottom of the canyon, but he did leave them near the bottom of the canyon, and it was a very poor choice. But again, you take his background. He came from California, where you rode in, you shot a bunch of Indians, and you rode away. It was easy, you know. And I don't think he was thinking about defense. He was thinking about going in there, and the last thing on his mind was that the Apache would actually come around and attack. So we think that was not quite true the way he described that. Again, from the size of the artifact scatter where the village is, we don't think there was 200 to 300 Apache warriors. He does describe briefly retreating to a small ridge before he goes up the other side. That part seems true. And then he says that when they came down here, instead of turning and going down the trail that they had came up, they went straight up the side of a mountain. And I think that part's true as well. They did go straight up, but we didn't find evidence that they met the Apache up on top. Now at that point, Davidson had an option. He could have gone on over the ridge down into the canyon and retreated. Probably would not have lost any more soldiers. But I think he felt that the battle was over. He'd gotten away from it. He was no longer on the low ground. He was on the high ground. So he decided to go on down the ridge and tie back into the trail back to Cieneguilla. Unfortunately, when he got down to the point of the ridge, that's where it narrows down to where you couldn't even ride more than 2 horses side by side through a lot of it. So it was a very narrow ridge with very steep sides. Once he got there, the Jicarilla hit him off on the front, so he couldn't proceed any farther, and then they came in behind him and they had him pinned on this narrow ridge. The description of the battle tells that he would move for a ways, they'd stop, they'd fire, they'd pick up, they'd move a little ways, turn around, fire some more, until finally they saw their chance to break away and they went down the ridge into the next canyon and got away. We think that was probably a very accurate description of the battle. This part, they'd already been fighting the Apache for a couple of hours. They'd lost a lot of men, they were wounded, and they were getting soundly beaten along here. 17 of the remaining soldiers died. The artifacts indicate that it was a much more frantic fight at this point. 70% of the percussion caps that we found were dropped that had never been fired. So you can just picture somebody trying to put that 1/4-inch cap on the gun and dropping it. Most of the round balls that we found were dropped and had never been fired. And it was also along here that we found some of the tools, a pocket knife, other things that, again, had been dropped and that indicated that things were pretty hot and heavy at this point. This is just, again, a map showing our interpretation of the artifact scatters, pretty much the way I just described it. The trail coming in, the dismount, the camp, the retreat route, and then going out the other side. This is a picture painted by Gerald Naylor at Piccaries. In fact, it's of the version of the battle that says that the Jicarilla actually helped. He's got, it's kind of hard to see on here, but he's got soldiers coming up a little narrow area with the Indians waiting to attack, and a dog out front. And that was one thing that was interesting about both the later account, the one Jack Boyer recorded, and an account recorded in around 1911 by Pliny Goddard, who interviewed some Jicarilla Apache, that talked about soldiers coming in and they were accompanied with a dog. And we don't know if they really actually had a dog with them or if somehow this all got combined into one story. But the story was that they saw the soldiers coming, one of the Indians shot the dog with an arrow, and that was the signal that the battle was about to begin. Now you can see the terrain in this painting here is very similar to the original slide I showed you with the terrain of where the battle took place. One big difference is it showed the Indians hiding behind some cliffs. There were no cliffs or anything like that out here. This is actually looking a pretty good overview of the entire battle. The center of the screen here in the low ground is the location where the horses were, where the soldiers dismounted, and where they were pinned down. The Indian camp was up on top of this ridge here. So you can see that they dismounted, hiked all the way up this ridge to fight the Indians that were up on top. Again, probably not the best strategy. The terrain is steep, but they could have ridden up a little bit farther. Of course, that is one thing about dragoons. They fought on foot. They weren't like the cavalry that would ride in shooting on horseback. They were essentially mounted cavalry, or mounted infantry, where they would ride in and then dismount and fight on foot. After they came back here, there's a little low ridge in here, which is where they went to very briefly, maybe 10 minutes, but found again that it still was not a good location. And this is the ridge they saw in the distance. They felt that, well, if we get the high ground, then we're good. So they went straight up the side of this mountain, the ridge over here, to get up on top. Now you don't quite have in this view the ridge that they went down where the final retreat took place. It's actually on the other side of this, but it's very much like this, a steep, narrow ridge that kind of slowly led down, and that's where they got pinned down for the last part of the battle. After the court of inquiry, let me give you a little background on the court of inquiry. Right after the battle, Lieutenant Bell, who was stationed here, wrote a letter that was very critical of Davidson and the fact that he had lost so many of his men, claimed that he had left his soldiers in the bottom of a canyon, that it was an unorganized fight, and that anybody would be court-martialed over this type of blunder. Davidson, of course, took issue with that, and he's the one that called for the court of inquiry. So it wasn't the military looking into Davidson's action to find out why he lost the men. It was Davidson calling the court of inquiry to defend his reputation. And it was interesting that Davidson was the one who asked most of the questions. He would ask leading questions, the soldiers would get up and testify. But because of this court of inquiry, we had a very detailed written record of various soldiers' accounts of what happened at the battle. At the end of the court of inquiry, Davidson had asked the court to come out to the battle and see for themselves what had taken place, and they declined. They decided they didn't need to look at it, and they had three findings. One that Captain, at this point he'd already been promoted to a captain, by the way. Captain Davidson, 1st Dragoons, could not, under the circumstances, with honor, have avoided the battle near Cieneguilla on the 30th of March, 1854. So they believed his testimony and the others that the Indians called down for a fight, and if he'd left, he'd have been branded a coward, so he had to fight. They also found that in the battle he exhibited skill in his mode of attacking a greatly superior force. And again, they believed the 200 to 300 warriors of hostile Indians, and prudence and coolness and courage throughout a protracted engagement. And finally, when he was obliged to retire from the field, owing to the great odds opposing him, the losses he had sustained, and the scarcity of ammunition, his exertions to bring off the wounded men merit high praise. And that is a good point. He lost a lot of men on the ground, but 23 wounded soldiers had to make it back to the camp amidst all of this fighting. And he did bring back a lot of the wounded, and a number of them very severely wounded. And Davidson himself was wounded. I believe he was shot in the shoulder with an arrow. Probably at the time not considered one of the serious wounds, but there were a number of people that were severely wounded. And then finally, his official report of the battle, that was the half a page that he wrote, was far from claiming more than to which he was justly entitled, is rather one entirely worthy of the character of a modest and gallant gentleman. So in the end, his name was cleared. They decided he was a good soldier, he was a gentleman, he brought the wounded off. He already within the previous 2 years been promoted to a captain. He went on to the Civil War and attained the rank of general. Lieutenant Bell, on the other hand, stayed a lieutenant. He never rose above that rank, and he was killed in action a few years later in Arizona, I believe. And that's the last slide. So that's, I think I rushed through it a little quickly, but that's the account of the Battle of Cieneguilla that happened back in 1854. So I guess at this point I'd like to open it up for questions.
How about snow?
There's no mention of snow, but it was, end of March, up around maybe 8,000 feet, a little over 8,000 feet. They do describe in one of the accounts that they saw snow in the mountains, which indicates to me that where they were at the time, maybe the snow had melted off. But we were at the battle site one time in December, and there was a lot of snow everywhere, but once we got up there, it was almost completely bare. I think it has to do with the terrain and the openness of at least where the Indian camp was. Now the rest of the areas, there were still patches of snow. We don't know for sure, but it apparently wasn't a major factor because it would have been mentioned more, I think, in the testimonies. In the back.
At the Taos Junction Bridge, which is about 6 miles in from Highway 68, there's a little knoll there with a building that has deteriorated over a great period of time.
Hotel.
And I'm wondering where the current village of Pilar sits in relation to where the battlefield was, and if that was part of it.
That was too far away. The battle is between the existing village of Pilar, which was Cieneguilla, and Picaris Pueblo up in the mountains. And it's a difficult place to get to. At the time we were doing the research, there was a Forest Service road that had been closed off that we opened up so we could have access in there. After 2 years, and we hiked in carrying metal detectors and everything from the bottom for a while, and it just was a little difficult. So we opened up the road to finish up the research, also to bring some of the Apache elders up that were very interested in seeing the site. And then once we were done with the research, the road was closed again for other concerns, wildlife, environmental concerns. Also helps to protect the site as well. But it is up in the steep country, away from Pilar, away from the Rio Grande.
Where did the Jicarilla go after the battle?
After the battle, they crossed the Rio Grande and started heading up north, kind of west of Tres Piedras, up in the mountains. And within a matter of a week or so, they assembled a large group of soldiers to track the Jicarilla Apache. And I think this is important too. Some accounts had earlier said that the Utes were with the Jicarilla Apache. And even now, that with the later accounts saying that the Picarees were part of the battle. The soldiers went after the Jicarilla. They didn't go after the Utes, they didn't go after the Picarees. They went after the Jicarilla, and they caught them west of Tres Piedras, and there was another battle up there. A number of them escaped, and they chased them around the mountains for a couple of months, but finally they gave up. Yes?
I think an interesting part of it was the age of the dragoons. Some of them were very, very young.
A lot of them were very young. I think some of the sergeants were probably the oldest soldiers, but the enlisted men were very young. Davidson wasn't very old either. And there's no Hispanic surnames among them. They're all from back east. A lot of them probably weren't quite sure what they were getting into when they joined the military. There's one of them named, there's a diary by a soldier named Bennett that describes his account of the battle. He was there and got shot through both legs, had to grab 2 horses and get dragged for about a mile to get away from the battle and survive. It's interesting though, when you look at the records, he registered under the name of Bronson. So we don't know if there's something he was trying to hide, or maybe he was underage. Maybe he wasn't even old enough to join the military. But he made it through the battle. He stayed in for another couple of years, I believe, and then he deserted a couple of years later.
You know, another one of the troopers was Aaron Stevens, the Harper's Ferry raider with John Brown.
Is that right?
Participant in these companies participated in the Taos Mutiny a year later.
Yeah. And another thing that Major Blake, who was the commander here at Fort Bergman, he spent most of his time in Taos. He didn't see that it was a good place out here to be, so, and there's more alcohol in Taos anyway, so he spent some time there, and there was this riot in Taos, and Blake was instigated. I don't know the whole story, I haven't really looked into that enough, but he was court-martialed over it, and the court-martial took place within a few months of the court of inquiry into Davidson's affair, and part of the court-martial of Blake included charges that were levied by Davidson. And right before the court-martial, those charges were withdrawn. And then right after that, Davidson's court of inquiry came up where everybody testified that he did a good job. So it kind of makes you wonder what was going on there as well. There's some kind of collusion. In the back?
It seems to me that if you were going to be reviewing Davidson's performance because of what you found, that you wouldn't give him as great accommodations as what he got. Is that right?
You would think.
Okay.
You would think, yeah. Well, and I think it's just a description of the time. Well, within a half a year of this battle, there was one called the Grattan Massacre, where a lieutenant went into a group or a camp of Sioux Indians, greatly outnumbered, to arrest or take back an Indian that had shot a cow. And the story was that he and his interpreter had been drinking heavily on the way over to the Indian camp. And when he got there, the interpreter got all obnoxious and somebody shot him or fired a shot, and then suddenly everybody started shooting, and every one of the soldiers was killed. And there were some people pushing for an inquiry into that one, and they kept getting the answer that no, this was a gallant soldier that died on the field, we don't want to sully his name, you know, let's not go there. And I think there finally was a bit of an investigation, but it wasn't the outcome you would have expected in that either. I think they were more concerned about the reputation of a soldier and maintaining his reputation.
Do the Apache have an oral history?
They don't, or at least not that we were able to come up with. I was in a meeting with the tribal council over at Dulce, and a lot of it was in Apache, so I wasn't sure what was going on. It went on for 2-3 hours. But there was one or two people that stood up, and one of them said, we were told to never talk about this battle. Another one said that we know about it, but we heard that all of the soldiers had been killed. So I think there is an oral history, oral tradition with the Apache, but they weren't willing to share it, which is not unusual. But then on the other hand, you figure most of the elders had long since gone, and if it was the sort of thing that they didn't like to talk about, a lot of that memory may have gone with it. That one account that Pliny Goddard recorded in 1911, it doesn't call it this battle, but from the description you can tell it was the same battle. So he was talking to somebody back in 1911 that had knowledge of it, so I think it's probably there.
How many Apaches were killed? Do the records show the number?
The records are very, very vague on that as well. There was one letter that it referred to 2 Apache being killed, but then there was another interview at one time with Chief Chacon, who was in the area and in fact may have been the leader of the group that was up there. Chacon claimed that he was away hunting or traveling with some Ute warriors at the time and he wasn't there, but in his interview I think he said there was 50 Apaches killed, which would probably be a fairly accurate assumption. I would think that with the superior arms of the dragoons and the length of time they were out there, that there probably were dozens of Apache that were killed.
Is the Forest Service doing similar studies of other battles elsewhere?
Yeah, as funding and time permits. When I was down on the Lincoln National Forest, and not long after I left to come up to Taos, we had done studies on 2 battle sites down there involving Mescalero and the cavalry. There's a battle site over in Arizona on the Coconino that they're doing some investigations on. So it's starting to, there's a number of studies going on, but funding is a real issue. In fact, this one, a large part of my funding came from the Park Service. I got a grant from the Battlefield Protection Program that funded a lot of it, and then a lot of it we did on weekends and on our spare time, and partly as a result, I'm still working on the final report for those of you that keep asking me for it. But it's getting close, and it will be done hopefully next year as one of our publications. Now that I'm in the regional office, we have a publication series, and so I've worked this into our next publication.
I may have missed this, but why did Davidson go there in the first place?
He was ordered by Blake to go and observe this group of Apache, because we knew that they were over on the east side of the mountains where some raiding had gone on. They were watching them camp at Mora, and they knew they were headed over towards Piccaries. So he wasn't sent to fight the Apaches. He was sent to watch them and kind of see where they went. And again, the record's unclear if indeed somebody calling down and saying, hey, if you want to fight, come on up. If that's it, you know, if after that you got no choice but you got to have a battle, then maybe it was the Apaches that started the battle. But I think it was probably Davidson looking for glory. You know, he was familiar with just walking in, shooting Indians and leaving, and he just wasn't really ready for it.
One more?
Here.
I wasn't clear of Carson's role. How soon after he
Kit Carson, the Apache had come through the trail from Mora over towards Picaris, near here, just a few days before the battle. I think about maybe a day after they had come through, a couple of the chiefs came down to the fort, and Kit Carson was here and met with them, and they told him that they were just going there to make pottery and looking for peace. And within 2 days of that, 3 days, I'd have to refresh my memory on that, but within a matter of days after that is when Davidson went and the battle started. So he was privy to that knowledge that they were not hostile, or at least according to Kit Carson, they were not hostile. But it's interesting though, in the court of inquiry, Kit Carson testified in defense of Davidson. Whereas right after the battle, Kit Carson wrote a letter saying that he felt that the Apaches had been drawn into the battle and did not win the battle. So something changed there. And I know you said one more, but there was somebody in the very back that was going to try to ask a question.
Okay.
I'm curious about the spurs. It does seem like real good terrain to wear spurs in, and you said they had to climb up this one hill. Where did you find these spurs? Was it one particular place before they climbed up the hill when they were fleeing?
We found one of them in the Indian camp. In fact, I'm glad you brought that up. We found a spur, some drawn percussion caps, and a military button inside the Indian camp. And I believe it was Sergeant Kent, when he reached the Indian camp, was killed in the Indian camp. So it's probably a fairly good assumption that this is marking the location where that sergeant had been killed. 2 of them were in the very brief retreat to the small knoll where he was for about maybe 10 minutes. So it was after they'd been pinned down for a while and they were leading their horses across some fairly rough terrain. We found 2 of the spurs there. And then in the final retreat where they had to go down the steep slope, some of them with horses, but a lot of them running or leading their horses was where we found the other one. So yeah, it's probably the terrain was way too rough to be running around the spur.